Your support helps us bring you programs you love. Go to wyomingpbs.org, click on Support, and become a sustaining member or an annual member. It's easy and secure. Thank you.
The Society of Professional Journalists came to Casper this year and hoped to learn not only why the people in the conservative state of Wyoming distrust the media so much, but also what the industry itself could change to address the issue of media distrust nationwide. Our cameras watched their final session in Casper. The highlights from the Casper project, that's next.
Funding for this program is made possible in part by the Wyoming Humanities Council, helping Wyoming take a closer look at life through the humanities, thinkwy.org, and by the members of the Wyoming PBS Foundation. Thank you for your support.
Good evening, and thank you for coming out for this event. The Society of Professional Journalists and the Society for Professional Journalists Foundation decided that we need to understand better why people don't trust the media. It is an institution that is important to our democracy, yet there's a disconnect, and that's concerning. And so we started a project here in Casper where we got together about 30 people to talk about the issues of trust and other issues that they have regarding journalism and the press, and why they don't believe everything that they're reading, or even most of what they're reading and seeing. And so this group of about 20 or 30 people, we've been meeting periodically, and we have some really good discussions, some tense discussions at times, and those participants are here among you. But today, we decided that we would broaden this conversation to include as many people in Casper who wanted to join in. In our sessions, we talked about such things as how do you identify news and distinguish it from other types of information, such as propaganda or even advertising. We talked about bias and what is bias and how do you recognize it, and when is it really bias? We also toured a couple of newsrooms. We went to KT Television, and we also went to the Casper Star Tribune, and people got a chance to see how the news is put together. Then we gave our panel an opportunity to speak directly to journalists. We had journalists right here in Casper to come out and talk to our group, and we gave our members an opportunity to ask them the questions that they have that might help them understand what is the process for putting together news and what are the steps that you take to make sure what you are producing is correct and accurate and fair. Tonight, we're doing the natural next step, and that is to give you, as well as our participants, an opportunity to talk to national journalists. Survey after survey tells us that people trust their local news organizations more than they do their national. And so that's why we thought it was important to broaden this and give all of Casper a chance to talk to national journalists who are involved in shaping the news, the national news that you get into your homes. So I want to thank you for coming out, and I encourage you to participate in this important discussion. It will be informative for the journalists on the panel, as well as we hope for you. I want to bring out for you now the leadership of the organizations that I work for. We have Erwin Gratz, who is the president of the Society of Professional Journalists Foundation, and J. Alex Tarquinio, who is the president of the Society of Professional Journalists. Thank you.
Thank you, Rod, and good evening to all of you. I'm Erwin Gratz. I've been a broadcast journalist for 40 years, currently working for Maine Public Radio as a host and anchor of Morning Edition. And my message tonight is on behalf of our foundation. It's a very simple one, really. It is, as Rod mentioned, thank you. Not only to our panelists, to Governor Sullivan, who will moderate, but to you. We have been putting this project, pursuing this project in the hope that if you have a better sense of what it is we do, we are less likely to be viewed as your enemy than as your servant, which is the way broadcast journalists and print journalists see themselves. The questions and comments that you bring to this forum tonight, as Rod mentioned, will help those of us who are here better understand you, help us better do our jobs. And we're also hoping, and this is also important to say, Casper is a pilot project, an experiment, if you will, for us in engaging members of the public with journalists. If, as we already suspect, this project is deemed a success, we plan to replicate it many other places around the country. The foundation supports the work of the Society of Professional Journalists, which is this nation's most broad-based journalism organization, and it is my pleasure now to introduce the Society's president, Alex Tarquinio.
Thank you, Erwin. And welcome to the final event in our Casper project. This is a different sort of project for us. Ordinarily, our programming involves training or inspiring journalists to do great work. But last year, we decided to take a new tack. We first began by sending journalists into middle schools and high schools across the country to teach workshops on how to recognize verified news in a program we call Press for Education. And we were so encouraged by that project that we wanted to reach out to the public beyond the classroom. So I hope those of you who participated in the project here in Casper felt that you found that as a valuable experience. Now we're concluding with an all-star panel looking at the pervasive mistrust of the media, a nationwide concern that really begs a solution before it undermines our democracy. As Americans, we have an innate trust in the freedom of speech and of the press, yet many of ourselves now find ourselves dubious of information, especially that we read online, because it is easily manipulated or repackaged in numberless viewpoints. Unfortunately, in nations and cities across America, deep-seated mistrust has now led to a growing lack of confidence in our national news media. Well, tonight, we're handing the microphone to you. The journalists in the room look forward to hearing how you view the modern news media and what we need to do to regain your trust. So thank you very much for joining us tonight.
A very pleasant good day to each of you, and welcome. I would like to personally thank the SPJ journalists on call, who, as you already met him, Mr. Rod Hicks, who has developed and managed this marvelous project. Please give him a round of applause. Pete Williams, justice correspondent for NBC News and a native of this beautiful Platte Valley, was scheduled to moderate the forum. The delay of the Mueller hearing in D.C. has prevented his appearance here today. The suits at NBC News can't get along without him, so he will not be with us. But he will address you via videotape. So today, joining us as moderator will be Mike Sullivan. As most of you know, Mike grew up in Douglas and practiced law in Casper, and of course was governor from 1987 until 1995. Those were, ladies and gentlemen, as you may remember, some tough times. Life has many ways of testing the person's will, either by having nothing happen at all or by having everything happen at once. And it did, and Mike pulled us through. When Mike ran for governor, he went around the state always appearing in a beat-up cowboy hat. His campaign staff spent long hours beating up those hats. I don't know if you knew that or not. He was, as you may remember, U.S. Ambassador to Ireland from 1998 until 2001. Only in America could a guy named Sullivan be named ambassador to Ireland. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Mike Sullivan.
Well, my thanks, good evening. My thanks to you for coming, for being here for what I hope is an important conversation and a real opportunity. I know it's an opportunity because I've met the panelists and know that it affords us an opportunity for a conversation. I want to urge you, and I believe it will be true, that this is a civil conversation. As many of you know, I've participated in a few panels about civility. And while I have no question in my mind, there will be many differences of opinion aired here this evening because I know the people of Wyoming. I also am confident that it will be a civil discussion and one in which we can all be proud and happy to have attended. For tonight is as much about hearing what you have to say and what questions you have as it is about hearing from the outstanding panelists presented us tonight by the Society of Professional Journalists. And I have to admit, this is a different role for me, the politician asking questions of the journalists, because I have reserved the right to ask some questions. Now, these panelists, as I've already said, are outstanding journalists, and we're happy to have them here. But as Al Simpson said, they wanted to get here in the worst way, and most of them did. Rod Hicks, who you have already heard from, spent until 2 a.m. in the Denver airport waiting to be told that the plane was canceled. Some of you have experienced that. 3 of the other panelists, I believe, came through hailstorms on their way here. One of the panelists had the good fortune to find himself in Cheyenne the first day of the opening of the Capitol, and that was a special privilege. But let's introduce them to you now. Each has a long list of accomplishments in the field, but I'm just going to give you some of the highlights so we can get to the meat of the program and the conversation. The first panelist is Hayes Brown. He's a world news editor and senior reporter for BuzzFeed News, covering the breaking news around the globe. He can also be seen as a guest host for BuzzFeed programming that's live streamed on Twitter, broadcast, as well by way of Facebook. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Hayes Brown. And Hayes, I can only say that they didn't have Twitter, Facebook, or BuzzFeed when I was in office. So I don't know how I'm going to handle you.
Just treat me like everyone else.
Lori Montgomery is Deputy National Editor at the Washington Post, where she helps manage coverage of the Trump administration and Robert Mueller's investigation into Russian involvement in the 2016 election. She previously was Europe bureau chief for Knight Ridder newspapers. Please welcome Lori. Noreen Gillespie's wide-ranging career has included deputy sports editor, leading coverage of the Rio Olympics, a legislative reporter in Hartford, Connecticut, and now deputy managing editor for U.S. News at the Associated Press. In this role, she oversees a team of journalists based in all 50 states. Please give a warm welcome to Noreen. And after working in various positions at Dow Jones and Company, Neil Lipschutz became top editor for Dow Jones Newswires and then standards and ethics editor for the Wall Street Journal. Today, he's deputy editor-in-chief at the Wall Street Journal. Please welcome Neil. And I'm going to take a seat, and I've reserved the right to ask the first question. Then I hope you'll trample over each other trying to get to the microphone so you can both share your opinions and ask your questions of these panelists. Thank you very much. Good evening. Good evening. This is a question that I have been interested in, and this panel brought it to my mind. And I think we just as well start here because it has some local currency. And that is, have you considered, or can you comment upon, what impact geographic and demographic bias for journalists may have in the reporting that takes place in the national news? And I've seen it referred to, just so we understand what I'm referring to, is the bubble of the coastal cities that generates the national news. Anybody like to start?
I'll take a crack. Listen, I feel very strongly that diversity in newsrooms is crucially important. Diversity by race, diversity by ethnicity, national origin, diversity by gender in positions of authority, decision-making positions. But I do agree with you that geographic diversity, and frankly, I think diversity of economic circumstance, if I can use that phrase, are equally important, because I do think that while I do believe people can make decisions broadly and empathize with people in circumstances other than their own, people bringing a wide range of their own experiences to the decision-making and to the reporting and to the editing, whether it's video or words or digital publication, I do think helps, and I think that it is an important factor, and one, like all diversity, that many newsrooms can do better at.
I'll take a crack at it too. So I was thinking about this very question on the drive up here from Denver.
Good. That's because you realize you're in a different place.
Yeah, I mean, driving across the beautiful countryside, by the way, thank you for having us. This is a gorgeous place. The things that we dwell on in Washington seem very far away and a little bit ridiculous. And, I grew up on a farm outside of Pittsburgh, and when I go home to see my mom, as I will this weekend when she turns 80, Washington also seems very far away and a little ridiculous. But, at the Washington Post, we come from all different places. And, because we are trying to cover your government, I mean, the people who are running the country, you have to sort of get into that bubble and understand it. And so I think that we all try to bring our individual experiences to that reporting, but it's hard to tell you and explain in as clearly as possible what's happening without actually immersing yourself in that bubble. So that doesn't maybe totally satisfy your question, but that's kind of how it is.
One of the things that we try to do, you mentioned before that we have reporters in all 50 states, and that's something that we're really proud of at AP. We have at least one person, if not more, in every state capital. And I think that footprint to us, that physical presence in all of these places, informs the way that we report. And we deliberately try to construct our coverage teams, whether it's on something like immigration or whether it's our 2020 campaign team, to take advantage of that. We want to make sure that we're pulling reporting and observations from people who live in the communities that we're writing about. And that means, we have people all over the country who are going to church, going to school, and live in the places that we want to pull those observations from. So when we talk about stories, we construct the conversations and the participants of the team with that in mind. Does it get us all the way there? I'm sure that you can point to places where we can improve, and I think as an industry, we're always looking for ways to do that. But that's one way that we try to address it at the Associated Press.
So I'm going to talk about BuzzFeed News and the way that we think about this in two parts, really. So first of all, I work on the World News Desk, so I'm working with correspondents based around the world, and one of the biggest enemies of people who are foreign correspondents is something called parachute journalism. That's where someone who is not from a place comes in, spends like 2 or 3 days there, writes a story about it, and leaves. And people left behind are wondering, well, what is this place you've written about? I don't recognize it. So we're constantly telling our reporters, and honestly, they're very good, so they're very good at this, that they need to work to avoid that. They need to actually be speaking to the people who are being affected by whatever issue they're covering. They need to actually be talking to people who have lived whatever it is they're writing about, who are from that community, much like the AP does. Here's a secret for you, though, about a lot of media institutions. A lot of them are broke. It is not a good industry to be in terms of money and in terms of trying to make it so that you can have a wide range of coverage. That's why you'll notice that I know that you guys have a lot of great local papers out here, but around the country, a lot of those are closing. And so national papers, national media outlets like the Associated Press are being left to fill those gaps. So I think that a big part of why national media can struggle sometimes to seem to be doing its best to cover the issues the way that they're being viewed from the communities that are actually experiencing them is a lack of time or resources. Like, for example, on our breaking news desk in Los Angeles, where you would expect not many people to care about Western lands, we had a reporter named Jim who was obsessed with covering the minutia of how Western lands, especially those being administered by the federal government, which is a huge part of the West, how that's actually being handled. Unfortunately, he's moved on to another outlet, but I just wanted to bring him up as an example of, even if people are based in Los Angeles, based in New York, based in Washington, D.C., they still bring with them their interests and their desire to cover those issues. It's all a matter of, can they have the time and resources to actually go and do that reporting and do that journalism?
A Gallup poll showed that the trustworthiness of journalists rated at 32%. Journalists ranked just ahead of car salesmen in Congress. And I think until the media and journalists and hard news recognize they have an issue, they have a problem, it's never going to be corrected. And if the media, hard news journalists don't recognize they have a problem, the 32% is going to continue to go down. Thank you.
Can I ask a follow-up of you? When you say hard news journalists, tell us a little bit more about what your definition is. It us on this stage? Are there other outlets that you're considering?
Well, no, I'm referring to news anchors and referring to journalists. So I'm referring to news reporters on CNN, to the AP, writers of the AP, the Washington Post, the New York Times, certainly not as much the Wall Street Journal, but...
Are you referring to news or are you referring to opinion?
No, I have this conversation, I've had it for 5 months. I know the difference between opinion. I know the difference between hard news. And so we've spent the last 5 months demonstrating hard news bias. So I don't want to waste...
Well, could you maybe give us an example of what you mean?
Hard news is an AP article in the paper. I mean, I
know, but of bias. What are you talking about when you talk about liberal bias?
So you don't understand what liberal bias is?
I want to understand what you mean.
Well, well, it could either be how something's reported, an angle, but mostly opinion written by journalists. So instead of journalists writing facts and describing the facts and the news story, they interject their opinions in the article. So it's supposed to be hard news, but what comes out is opinion. So as an example, say an article that refers to people that support abortion to be activist, and somebody that opposes abortion, they're anti, they have an anti-agenda against abortion. It's just the way you present something. That's just a small example. But again, I don't want to take all of everyone's time in going through it, because I provided, 15, 20 different hard news articles that showed liberal bias in reporting. And I think it's even further than that. I think it's really not what you report, it's what you don't report. It's when the stories are positive towards conservative ideas, they get buried or they get ignored.
You're invested in the narrative of this country, and you're invested in how it's reported. And that's the whole point of the conversation we're going to have here today. So I think we can have this conversation respectfully.
Sure.
I think I'd like to stay away tonight from discussion of individual articles, though I'm happy to talk to you on the side about that, just because I want to make sure that I have my information correct about the articles that you're referring to. And I can't possibly know 5 years of coverage sitting here on the stage tonight, but I'd like to continue that conversation with you. I will say broadly that you've mentioned a couple of different topics. You've mentioned Russia, you've mentioned abortion, you've mentioned a few other things. One of the things that we do at AP is we have a style book that talks about language and usage, and we share that with the industry. And it guides us in how we discuss, in an unbiased way, issues like abortion and issues, even on stories that come up and change that aren't in the style book, we're constantly having conversations about that language. We have readers in the US and we have customers that we, like the local paper here, that our content goes to be shared with other audiences. Sometimes those editors reach out to us and say, you know what? We think that you didn't describe that right. And we think you're off. And sometimes we change it, and sometimes we'll go back and we'll say, this is the reason why we believe it's sound. And I think the hallmark of an organization that's committed to being transparent and an organization that's committed to accurate reporting has to be able to stand up and say when they've gotten it wrong. And none of us sitting up here are perfect. But we do go through a lot of processes, whether it's multiple layers of editing on a story, whether it's thinking very deliberately about the type of language that we're using, and hearing feedback from both people in the newsrooms that we work with and people who are consuming the news to inform those decisions. So I don't want you to sit down. I want you to keep telling us if you think that we're not getting it right. And I thank you for voicing what you voiced today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Can I take one aspect of your question? At the Wall Street Journal, obviously, a lot of what we report on is business and finance oriented. And to the degree you're looking for, the good news of the last few years, we've reported extensively, as have others, about, the record high levels of employment, the low unemployment rate. Some of the issues, obviously, we also deal with of income disparities in the country and wealth disparities. But, the good news of the economy has certainly been something I think widely reported. I would just offer one other thought about all the investigations of the president. Again, I'll speak for the Journal, but I do think it is probably a bit more broadly applicable. When news organizations report accusations or ongoing federally mandated investigations, such as the Mueller investigation, they're not saying we agree with every aspect or that we agree that there is something there. We're reporting on important news. I would venture for all Americans that these investigations are going on, and also reporting the claims of some other elected officials about what they think might be there. Of course, to be fair, all sides should be quoted. Certainly the administration's view should always be quoted. But I would only offer that covering an investigation does not mean that the Wall Street Journal has concluded that it will find some wrongdoing. It means we're reporting that there's an important investigation going on.
Can I just ask a quick question with that? So if somebody goes on and makes an outrageous claim, then don't you think you should have some evidence or do some research to make sure that that claim is correct before you report it?
I'm going to jump in there really quickly, because I think that a lot of what you're speaking about, in situations where you see someone on TV and they're just spouting off claims that you're going, that's not right, that's not real. Cable news is a very particular animal in the journalism world. Like, all of us up here are mostly print reporters. So the guidelines and the way that we go about reporting stories is pretty different. It's hard to correct people live on air like that. It's hard to know when to jump in. I think that one thing that a lot of people out here be surprised by is how much journalists get yelled at, not only by people who hold conservative views, but by people with liberal views, by other journalists. We yell at each other a lot if we think that someone has gotten the story wrong. So that's just a constant in this field. As far as what you see I will say that story choice is very important in newsrooms, because, like I said in my first answer, time and resources are everything for most news organizations. Time is the most important thing we can put out there. Time researching a story, time talking to people, time actually drafting the story, having it edited. We can't cover everything. So in a situation like we're seeing over the last couple of years, where there are a lot of things that are happening that have never happened before in the history of this country, and those things tend to rise to the top as far as at least our organization, because they're what we find to be more outside the norm, more weird, more distressing at times. And so those are what we help surface. I do think that something else that might surprise you, I remember seeing, I believe it was a week ago, during the debates between the Democrats. Do you know on Facebook which outlets had the most views? The answer is conservative outlets, your sites like Breitbart, the Daily Caller, etc. So when you talk about the idea that those stories aren't out there, that the coverage that skews a certain way towards the administration isn't out there, it is out there, and it's being well read by a lot of people. They're doing very well for themselves on Facebook, which a lot of people have also accused of trying to suppress conservative news. So I just wanted to bring those points to light in response to your questions.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello, my name is Pamela. Welcome to the Wild Wild West.
Thank you.
I'm so grateful that you have chosen to come to Wyoming, and I understand why. I happen to be somebody who is totally enthralled with journalism. It's my first love. I believe in the Fourth Estate. I believe in the work that you do and the truth-telling you try to do. And as somebody who loves this profession, I gotta say, I am so fed up with the gotcha journalism. It seems that we spend so much time focusing on sensational issues and not real issues. And I think the media is complicit in that. This last weekend is a perfect example. We've all gotten up in arms one way or another regarding the president's latest tweets. And the reality is, there are court cases going on. There are foreign policy issues that are going on. There are so many critical matters that we should be paying attention to. And instead, we're all up in arms, whether we're conservatives or liberals. And we're so tied up in these sensational gotcha issues, and we're not paying attention to real matters. And I just wonder, my question is, where do you fall in terms of your feelings of responsibility? For dealing with sensationalism versus the reality.
It's a good question. And I think one of the things that I would ask is who your audience is that you're talking about there. There's certainly sensational stories that exist across the US, but there's also good reporting going on all the time on issues outside of Washington. One of the stories that I'm proudest of this year that AP worked on was a collaboration with a number of media outlets in California around recovery from last year's wildfires. And what that did, we brought together a number of newsrooms across California to do an accountability-driven project looking at how many homes were in danger in the upcoming years from wildfires, and it concluded that 1 in 12 were. We gave data to newsrooms all across California so that they could tell that story for their local audience, so that they could describe how the danger pertained to the people who were living in their community that they cover every day. Those types of stories are important, and they are happening all over the US. We have so many choices about the news outlets that we can pay attention to and trust and consider to be reputable reporting. And there are stories outside of Washington. We tell them all the time. In the past couple of years at AP, we've told stories about women who've gone missing from Indian reservations and how a lot of those cases weren't looked at for decades. That reporting exists, and it's not hard to find. You just have to keep digging a little bit deeper to see it.
Yeah, I would just add again, speaking for the Wall Street Journal, we publish more than 200 articles a day. We have more than 1,000 journalists based all over the world. We have a print newspaper where several pages a day are devoted to world news, several pages are devoted to U.S. news. So, the breadth of what we're doing on substantive issues day in and day out is fairly broad. So again, I think that from a news readership point of view, there is a way to seek out various outlets because the media is not a monolith and people have different levels of both ambition in journalism and in breadth of coverage. And the coverage of substantive issues, I totally agree with you, which is extraordinarily important, I think is there if one looks.
Yeah, I would sort of echo the same thoughts. I mean, we have hundreds of journalists covering dozens of stories a day. We've covered, we have news about foreign policy. We have a big project underway about the effects of climate change. We had a major project in the last couple of years about fatal police shootings and unsolved homicides in small towns large and small across the country. So we cover lots and lots of things, but there's a website we go to that tells us what our traffic is. And you know what? When Donald Trump tweeted over the weekend about those 4 congresswomen, thousands of people flocked to that story. Now, does that mean that's why we cover it? That's not why we cover it. I think we have a responsibility to cover what the president says, particularly when what the president says is so far outside the norms of political discourse. We feel like we have to hold a mirror up to that. And so that people can see what it is. It's our responsibility. And, is it ideal that that's what people choose to focus on? Is it ideal that that's what the cable news channels, that's what the cry on is all the time? I don't think so. I mean, we should be reading more about the opioid crisis. We should be reading about any number of things. But for whatever reason, this president has captured people's attention.
And I just want to end this little round by saying, Pamela, BuzzFeed News, we focus a lot on what goes viral. We like to write stories that people want to share. That's how we think about it. When we're choosing and writing up our stories, we want to find stories that touch humanity and stories that once you read them, people immediately want to pass them on to other people so that they can read them too. And I gotta say, do you know how annoying it is when a story that has been like weeks, if not months, being written gets a couple thousand views versus a short post on the president's tweets that gets like 500,000. It's frustrating to us too. But much like she just said, they're still news because it is the president. If it was any other person just writing on Twitter, it would be a different story. But when that is the case, it is the president who is saying these things, it's our job to actually write about it. And we're a digital-only outlet, so we know exactly how many people have read each and every one of our stories. And we have what we call the news curation team, whose job it is to try and put those stories in front of people. We are begging people all the time to read our serious and sober pieces and trying to figure out strategies to get people to want to read about protests in Sudan, to want to read about climate change and the opioid crisis and all of these things. But when you have a situation where the president is writing things that makes a lot of the country feel cut off and alienated and othered, and like, why would you say that? That is extremely hurtful. That then becomes our responsibility to put that out there and say, look, though I will say, it has been shown that most people aren't on Twitter following Trump's tweets. They see what he says because of what we do. We put them out there because we decide that they are news, because he's the president. And so it's a tough balancing act to try and figure out how much weight do you give that versus how much do you spend your time and energy, again, our most precious resource, covering what he says on Twitter.
I wanted to shift focus a little bit. My name's Eric. I've been teaching on politics and the media for about 30 years now. Whew. And there's been persistent studies showing in surveys that American knowledge about basic political institutions, processes is in decline. And you combine that with the growth of confirmation bias, same surveys sort of showing that. So I'm just kind of shifting the focus off you for a second, on us, the viewers and the readers. What responsibility do we have to be better consumers, better listeners, and so forth? And I just kind of throw that out to.
Sure.
Thank you.
That's a wonderful question.
Thank you. I mean, listen, if I could start, I think that it is incredibly important. I think it is a very confusing place out there as a reader. I don't think there's any doubt about it. You know, it's the phrase that gets used is a lot of news comes at people sideways, right? They get it from a friend or an acquaintance on social media, or they're somehow introduced to a piece of news, and they don't either quickly look at or recognize the news organization that produced that piece of news, and they form opinions. I mean, we're in a day and age where literally anyone can become a publisher tomorrow. So, I mean, our view, my view certainly, is that news brands matter more than ever. Being able to discern between news and opinion, which is harder than ever, frankly, even when we properly label it, because news is atomized, right? I'm old enough certainly to remember a pre-internet era. When you read a print newspaper, you knew where the editorials were. You knew where the news was, you knew where the opinion was. And now I think for many readers, it comes at you from all angles. And it's even when labeled, it's hard to distinguish between the two. So I do think there is an obligation, and I think people talk about news literacy now and teaching it in schools, that there's more obligation on readers to look at the brand, look at what they stand for, look at their past history, look at how they treat correcting errors when they make errors. All those things, I think, add up to what gives a news brand integrity, and therefore should earn readers' trust. But the readers have to do some of that discovery themselves.
I think a byproduct of this environment has been that there's programs like this one, there's programs like MediaWise, there's curriculums that are coming up in school for elementary and middle school kids that kind of force them to start to have discussions about how do you evaluate a credible source. There's groups like the Trust Project that work with media organizations to try to instill basic indicators of trust for their audience. And I think that's a really positive trend. You've seen a lot of groups responding to that challenge. I didn't have media literacy skills when I was in school. Did any of you?
No, certainly not.
The fact that that's being incorporated into classrooms at a really young age, I think, is something that's needed and also something that's really encouraging. I have 3 young kids at home, and they have overheard more conversations with me and reporters than I think they would care to. But, what we do is we talk about, how the importance of being there, the importance of confirming through primary sources. And I think the more those conversations can be instilled at a very young age, you're building up the muscle to know how you can disseminate, fact from fiction.
Right. And I want to say that your point about confirmation bias is extremely important, since in this day and age, you can choose not only who you follow on social media, you can choose which news you go and check out. You can find someone who agrees with you on almost any point in the world. No matter what you believe in this world, somewhere on the internet, there is someone who agrees with you. So I think it's really important to have people be able to, when you see something, click the links back, follow it back. Where did this story first start? Did it start from the New York Times? Did it start from a meme someone saw on Facebook that someone threw together involving Hitler and AOC? Did it start, or did you just see a headline? There's so much that scrolls by us each and every day now that we're so invested online, so invested on our phones, that it's very difficult for people to take the time to sit and actually read through everything that goes by them. We found that, people read headlines. They don't read stories a lot of the time. People see what's in that first sentence and maybe the lead, and they make their decisions from there a lot of the time. So news organizations have to figure out how to make sure that both the headlines are accurate, that they fit into the context, fit enough context in there though still, that people can understand at a glance what's happening here. And there's been a lot of debate in the media about how you put those things out there. When the president says something and it's been proven to be false, like just say he cites a number about how much the economy has grown. Well, no, actually it's grown by this much. If you put out just in a headline, President, whatever he said, that in itself can be misleading. It's exactly the words he said, but if you're just reading the headlines, that's all you come away with. And that can be confusing, because then when you hear someone say something different, you're like, but I saw and heard that this was how it actually is. So people out there really do need to have more media literacy. They need to be able to do better Google searches. They need to be able to follow the source back to the primary source and figure out, where did this come from?
You raise a really important point. The question was, what can consumers do to make sure that they're armed with media literacy? One of the things that we can do too is that in our reporting, that we're tracing the origins of some of this information for you, that we're showing a couple of things, right? Where it originated, who embraced it, how it got into the national conversation, and why it's consequential. I think we're dealing with a whole scope of information out there. Some of it's intentional disinformation. Some of it's just things that people say that are wrong that we have to push back on. And some of it we don't know, we have to report out. But one of the things that we're really trying to do more and more is show that chain in all types of reporting, whether it's a news story or a fact check, because it's become such a big part of our environment with the internet. And just with discourse, kind of showing where an argument came from or showing where a piece of content came from is just a much part of our job today as interviewing people.
I've been listening for 40 some years to my colleagues complaining about bad press that they get. And I typically tell them that usually the cause of bad press in reporting on a legislative thing is that the reporter did not understand the subject matter at hand. Our reporters have to cover a wide spectrum of things. They cannot be expert in everything they report on. They just can't be. It's not humanly possible. And frequently we tend to talk in terms of jargon and make assumptions about background knowledge that are simply inaccurate. So the source has an obligation in terms of getting accurate reporting of making sure that the reporter understood. And frankly, most of the bad press I've seen has come when people did not get that across, and the journalists consulted their prejudices to complete the story because they didn't have the full story. Now, my assumption had always been that nationally, the reporters were more specialized, had more resources available, and could be counted on to do a little more of the background and understand the material a little better. And I'm starting to wonder if that is still true. You know, I rely on the Wall Street Journal quite a bit because I think they have the resources and take the time to get it right before they print it. But it seems to me that in many cases, the resources are no longer there, and that principle of a major cause of bad reporting is the reporter simply didn't understand, didn't have the time, didn't get the help from the sources that was needed. And my first question to you, is that a real problem at the national level?
I think that it is less a problem at the national level than it is at the local level. And I've personally covered 3 state legislatures in Texas, Michigan, and Maryland. And you know, the quality of information that you get, the amount of time that you guys have to explain things, the outside help you get, the staffing support is much less the reporters being specialized enough to understand what is happening with the flood control district or whatever it is. But it's the reporter's responsibility to ask the questions to get it right. I mean, fundamentally. I mean,
yes, but the reporter has a deadline.
Well, nonetheless, I mean, when you're a reporter, wherever you're a reporter, especially if your sources are picking up your newspaper and reading what you wrote, you find out very quickly what happens when you don't get it right. Mm-hmm. And that feels bad.
So bad.
And you don't want it to happen again. So you have to keep asking all those questions. On the national level, I think in terms of legislation, there are hundreds of reporters covering Congress. And there are it's like a whole herd of reporters that just do energy and foreign policy and, you know, economic policy. So I think that's less the case on the national level.
I have to thank you for looking at the relationship between source and reporter as just that, a relationship, because it is. And I think the stronger relationships are with sources, the better journalism comes out on the other side. I also spent time covering a state legislature. It was the first job I had at AP. And I was really lucky to have a mentor who helped me build those relationships and also helped show me how you build out a legislative story. Because when you're in that environment, you do go from topic to topic very quickly.
Especially on the last day of the session.
And you've got to learn how to research really well, and you have to know who to go to for what information, and you have to know what sources are available to you to be able to back it up with context and fact. I think, you asked the question about local newsrooms, and I'm glad that you did, because we know, and part of the reason many of us are here tonight is that there are fewer journalists in America right now than there were 10 years ago. That's just a fact. Newsrooms are smaller. And in communities like Casper that rely on local sources of information to understand state government, to understand local government, and to understand what's going on around them, that's something that we have to fight to save. And I think, we mentioned before, we've got reporters in all 50 state houses. In a lot of places, AP's reporters work with the other state house reporters, not just to mentor them, but to also see how we can all work together, right? Not collusion, and that's a really important distinction, but how we can work together to create more news that's valuable to you. And I think, you looking at the relationship with the journalists that are in a given legislature or in Congress as just that, a relationship will help us get there.
Okay. I want to raise one other point that I've seen locally and would like you to comment on. I'm increasingly seeing reporters, and somebody mentioned it earlier, who they'll report. The bias comes from how they select what they report and the angle they take on covering a story, and they'll report on the particular aspects of it that are interesting to them or that further their particular causes, and ignore the other things. I'm getting a feel with a number of them, like I do with the lobbyist, that I'm likely to hear the truth, but not the whole truth. And that bias in coverage in particular can be quite a problem. They just don't cover the key elements of the story. They cover what happens to interest them. And what's your perception of that at the national level? I've seen it come and go at the local level with particular reporters, and then your coverage is just biased for a year or two till they move on to a different market.
Go ahead. I'm sorry. I was just going to say, I think that, we're all editors up here, and I think it's the role of the editor at a news organization. And again, what you said earlier and what some of the folks up here said is important. A lot of this does, start with having enough resources, having enough people to go cover important stories, do it in a fair and whole way, but also having enough supervision of those reporters, of experienced editors who on their own understand the story that they're supervising, and therefore will know if the reporter comes back with only the part of the story, or frankly, perhaps not the most important part of the story, and that editor's responsibility is to ask that reporter to go out and do more reporting, talk to more people, and get the 360-degree view of whatever the subject is. So I think editing, strong editors, and again, this requires news organizations with greater resources. I think generally speaking, some of the national news organizations have more of those resources. The phrase, unfortunately, goes back to one of our earlier commenters. The phrase in journalism now is about local news deserts. Swaths of the country, except for perhaps the AP, where there's just no local coverage and much less expert editors, much less editors who've lived in the community for 30 years. And that's a problem. I don't know the solution to that problem, frankly.
Could I take a moment for a commercial?
I'm not sure if PBS will allow for that.
I promise you, it's not really a commercial. I want to thank Rob Hicks, who has put all of this together. And weeks after week after week, we had an opportunity to learn about the difference between opinion and fact. And there were a number of people that came to us week after week. I wish everybody could have participated in the full project. But Rob, thanks.
Funding for this program is made possible in part by the Wyoming Humanities Council, helping Wyoming take a closer look at life through the humanities, thinkwhy.org, and by the members of the Wyoming PBS Foundation. Thank you for your support.